The most dangerous moment in an empath's life is not when they finally stop caring. It is the moment before that. The moment when they are still trying, still explaining, still forgiving, still wondering why their heart feels exhausted from loving people who seem to become more comfortable hurting them. Because nobody tells you this part about being deeply empathetic. Your kindness was never the thing that destroyed you. Your ability to feel was never the weakness. The real danger was giving emotional access to people who never learned how to handle something that valuable. And the world rarely teaches you to see that difference. It teaches you to be understanding, to be patient, to see the good in people, to give another chance, then another, then another. But it rarely teaches you what happens when your empathy becomes an unlimited resource for someone who only knows how to take. You were taught to be easier to handle, not easier to understand. And that is why so many sensitive people reach a point where something inside them changes, not loudly, not dramatically, almost silently. One day, they simply stop reaching out. They stop explaining. They stop trying to convince someone to care, and the people around them become confused. Why are you so different now? What happened to you? Why are you so distant? But they do not understand. You did not become cold overnight. You became tired over time. There is a difference, because mature empaths do not stop caring because they suddenly lose their heart. They stop caring because they finally realize their heart was being treated like a place everyone could enter without permission. And that realization changes everything. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you remember sitting on your bed late at night, staring at your phone, rewriting a message over and over again. You were not even angry anymore. You were trying to find the perfect words, the perfect explanation, the perfect sentence that would finally make them understand why you were hurt. You deleted the message, typed another one, deleted that too. Because a part of you still believed that if you explained your pain clearly enough, they would finally see it. But that was the exhausting part. You were trying to prove a wound to the person who helped create it, and nobody talks about how painful that is. The kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. The exhaustion of explaining your feelings to someone who keeps asking for more explanations but never changes their behavior. People think empaths get hurt because they are too emotional. But what they do not understand is that many empaths are hurt because they notice what others ignore. They notice the pause before someone responds, the change in someone's tone, the energy shift when a conversation becomes uncomfortable, the hidden resentment behind a fake smile, the difference between someone saying, "I'm fine," and someone actually being fine. Your sensitivity was not a problem. Your awareness was not a problem. The problem was that you kept overriding the part of you that already knew, the part of you that noticed the pattern, the part of you that felt something was wrong long before your mind was ready to accept it. And this is where many empaths get trapped. Because society praises empathy when it makes you useful. When you are the person everyone calls when they need advice. When you are the one who forgives first. When you are the one who understands everyone's trauma. When you are the person who absorbs tension in the room so everyone else can feel comfortable. People love the empath who heals them. But they often struggle with the empath who protects themselves. Society gets uncomfortable when empathy makes you unavailable. When your kindness develops boundaries. When your understanding no longer comes with unlimited access. Because someone who understands emotions deeply is harder to manipulate. Someone who can read patterns is harder to control. Someone who finally trusts their own emotional signals is harder to keep inside a one-sided relationship. And this is why some people will celebrate your empathy when it benefits them, but question your character when you use that same empathy to protect yourself. They called you mature when you absorbed pain quietly. But they called you difficult when you finally named it. They praised your patience until your patience stopped serving them. They loved your forgiveness until forgiveness was no longer automatic. And that is the confusing moment many empaths experience. Because you start asking yourself, did I change? Did I become selfish? Did I lose the person I used to be? But the answer is usually much deeper. You did not lose yourself. You finally stopped abandoning yourself. Think about the person who always had to keep the peace, the person who entered every argument trying to understand the other side, the person who said, maybe they are just stressed, maybe they didn't mean it, maybe I am overreacting. The person who could explain everyone else's behavior, but struggled to explain why their own heart felt constantly exhausted. That person was not weak. That person was often carrying emotional responsibility that never belonged to them. They were trying to make sense of people who had no interest in making sense of themselves. And eventually, something inside the empath begins to shift. Not hatred, not revenge, not bitterness. Something quieter, awareness. A moment where they realize, I keep trying to become easier to love for people who were comfortable loving me only when I was easy to use. That realization is painful, because sometimes the hardest thing to accept is not that someone hurt you. It is that you kept giving them opportunities to do it again. You were not loyal to the pain. You were loyal to the version of them you hoped would return, the version who was kind in the beginning, the version who made promises, the version who made you believe that your patience would eventually be rewarded. And that is why letting go feels so complicated. You are not only letting go of a person, you are letting go of a future you imagined with them, the apology you were waiting for, the moment they finally understood your value, the moment they finally said, I see what I did to you. But sometimes that moment never comes, and the empath has to face the most painful question. What happens when you stop needing someone else to validate the pain they caused? Because that is where the transformation begins. Not when you stop feeling, not when you stop loving, but when you stop giving people the power to decide whether your feelings are real. The first stage of becoming impossible to control is not becoming stronger. It is becoming honest with yourself. Honest about the people who drain you. Honest about the patterns you keep excusing. Honest about the signals your own body has been sending you for years. Because before an empath stops caring about someone else, there is usually a deeper battle happening inside. The battle between what they feel and what they have been trained to ignore. And that is the part nobody sees. The real damage was never just what other people did to you. The real damage began when you learned to doubt the emotional intelligence that was trying to protect you. But the real question is not why people hurt you. The real question is why a part of you kept trying to save them. Because this is the hidden mechanism most empaths never talk about. The pain was not only coming from the people who took too much. It was coming from the belief that if you loved them correctly, they would eventually become safe. You thought your understanding could reach places where their own self-awareness had never gone. You thought if you were patient enough, gentle enough, forgiving enough, they would finally recognize what they had in front of them. But empathy has a shadow. And the shadow is believing that seeing someone's pain means you are responsible for healing it. You saw the reasons behind their behavior. You saw their childhood wounds, their fears, their insecurities, their hidden struggles. And because you could see those things, you started making excuses for the things that were hurting you. You became the person who said, I know they hurt me, but I know why they did it. And somehow, knowing why became a reason to tolerate what should have changed. That is the trap. Understanding someone does not mean you have to keep giving them access to you. You can understand someone's wounds and still recognize that their wounds are becoming your wounds. You can have compassion for someone's pain without volunteering to carry it. But many empaths were never taught that. They were taught that love means staying, that loyalty means enduring, that leaving means you failed someone. So they stayed in situations where their heart was constantly asking for protection. You know that feeling. The feeling of walking into a conversation already preparing your defense. The feeling of carefully choosing your words because you know anything you say might be turned against you. The feeling of checking your phone and feeling your stomach drop because you already know the message is going to bring another emotional storm. That is not peace. That is emotional survival. And the most painful part is that many empaths mistake survival for love. They think, if I am still fighting for this, it must mean it matters. But sometimes the reason you keep fighting is not because something is healthy. Sometimes it is because you have spent so long being the person who refuses to give up. And that identity becomes difficult to release. The person who always understands. The person who always forgives. The person who always stays. Until one day, that person becomes exhausted. Not physically exhausted, soul exhausted. The kind of exhaustion where you do not even want an apology anymore. You just want silence. You just want space. You just want one day where you do not have to explain why something hurt you. And that is when something inside begins to separate. A quiet, emotional distance begins forming. Not because you stopped loving, because you finally started listening. The part of you that knew something was wrong was never your enemy. It was the part of you trying to protect you. But for years, you ignored it because you were afraid of becoming the person who gives up on people. And that fear kept you attached to situations that were slowly teaching you to abandon yourself. The truth is, mature empaths do not lose their compassion. They lose their willingness to sacrifice themselves to prove they have compassion. And that is a completely different transformation. Because the next stage is not about learning how to care less. It is about understanding why guilt had so much power over you in the first place. Why saying no felt cruel. Why choosing yourself felt selfish. Why protecting your peace felt like you were hurting someone else. Because the deepest control over an empath rarely comes from another person. It comes from an internal belief that says, if I stop giving, I stop being a good person. And until that belief is confronted, the cycle continues. Because the wound they kept asking you to prove was never just about what they did. It was about why you kept feeling responsible for fixing what they broke. And that is where the real battle begins. People do not always take advantage of empaths because empaths are weak. Sometimes they take advantage because empaths have been trained to feel guilty for having limits. You were not afraid of losing the person. You were afraid of becoming the person who leaves. The person who says, I cannot do this anymore. The person who chooses peace over being needed. And for someone with a deeply empathetic heart, that can feel like a betrayal of who they are. But there is a difference between abandoning someone and finally refusing to abandon yourself. The moment you understand that difference, something begins to change. You stop seeing boundaries as cruelty. You stop seeing distance as hatred. You stop seeing silence as punishment. You begin to understand that sometimes silence is simply the place where your nervous system finally feels safe. Because after years of explaining yourself, defending yourself, and proving your intentions, there comes a moment when words feel empty. You realize the person who truly cares about understanding you does not need 100 explanations. And the person committed to misunderstanding you can turn 1,000 explanations into another argument. That realization hurts, because many empaths spend years believing the problem was their communication. If I just explain it better, if I just say it differently, if I just show them how much this affected me. But the truth is, Sometimes the issue was never that they could not understand. Sometimes they understood perfectly. They just did not want to change. And accepting that can feel like losing a part of yourself, because hope is powerful. Hope can keep you connected to someone long after reality has shown you the truth. You were not addicted to the person. You were addicted to the possibility that the person would finally become who they promised to be. And that is why mature empaths often look like they changed overnight. One day, they are fighting for the relationship. The next day, they are quiet. People around them wonder, what happened? But they never saw the thousands of small moments that happened before. The unanswered questions, the swallowed emotions, the nights spent replaying conversations, the times you forgave without receiving an apology, the moments when your body knew something was wrong, but your heart kept negotiating with reality. The silence did not come suddenly. The silence was built, piece by piece. Every ignored feeling, every dismissed concern, every time you chose understanding while receiving confusion in return. And eventually, the empath reaches a point where something inside becomes exhausted from begging to be understood. This is where the power begins. Not because they become heartless, not because they stop caring, but because they finally stop handing someone else the authority to define what they should tolerate. The person who once controlled the empath through guilt begins losing that control. Because guilt only works when you believe you are responsible for someone else's emotions. And that belief is the invisible chain that keeps many empaths trapped. But breaking that chain requires facing the deepest question yet. Who are you when you are no longer needed by the people who only valued what you provided? Because the answer to that question is where an empath's true transformation begins. But the final transformation is not becoming someone who feels less. It is becoming someone who finally understands that their feelings deserve protection too. Because for years, many empaths believe the goal is to become stronger by caring less. They think the answer is to become colder, more distant, more detached. But that is not what happens. The mature empath does not lose their heart. They simply stop leaving the door open for everyone to walk through it. And that difference is everything. Because the version of you that existed before was not wrong. The person who cared deeply, the person who believed in people, the person who looked beyond mistakes and searched for the reason behind them. That person was beautiful. The problem was never the heart. The problem was giving access to people who treated that heart like something they could repeatedly test. At some point, you realize something painful. Not everyone who needs your kindness deserves your closeness. Not everyone who understands your softness will respect it. And not everyone who tells you they love you knows how to love you without consuming you. That is the moment the empath begins to change. Quietly. Internally. They stop chasing closure from people who have already shown their answer through their actions. They stop waiting for someone to finally admit what they did. They stop looking for the perfect words that will make someone care. Because they discover something freeing. Your peace cannot depend on someone else finally becoming the person you needed them to be. And that realization is where emotional freedom begins. You stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And you start asking, why did I keep offering myself to someone who kept showing me they could not hold me? That question changes everything. Because the mature empath understands that love without respect becomes exhaustion. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. And forgiveness without change becomes permission. This is why some people become shocked when an empath finally walks away. They remember the person who always answered, the person who always listened, the person who always gave another chance. They cannot understand how someone so caring can become so quiet, but they misunderstand the silence. They think the silence is anger. It is not. They think the silence is revenge. It is not. The silence is what happens when someone has explained their pain so many times that they no longer need to prove it. It is the moment your silence becomes the answer. And this is the hidden shift that makes an empath difficult to control. They no longer need someone else to agree with their experience before they trust themselves. They no longer need permission to protect their peace. They no longer confuse being needed with being loved, because there is a version of an empath that exists after the breaking point. A version who still feels deeply, still loves deeply, still notices everything. But now they choose carefully where that energy goes. Their empathy is no longer an open door. It becomes a guarded home. And the people who once benefited from unlimited access suddenly feel the difference. Not because the empath became cruel, but because access was never supposed to be automatic. The greatest power an empath discovers is not the ability to stop caring. It is the ability to care without losing themselves. And that is why mature empaths do not become dangerous because they become cold. They become powerful because they finally understand the value of their own emotional world. But there is still one final layer. Because even after an empath learns to protect their peace, there is one last illusion they must release. The belief that they need the people who hurt them to understand why they left. Because the final freedom does not come when you stop giving access. It comes when you stop needing the wrong people to recognize what they lost. But something changes when an empath finally stops asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and starts asking, "Why did I keep believing I had to endure this?" Because the answer is not always comfortable. Sometimes the person who hurt you was not the only person who misunderstood your value. Sometimes you did too, not because you did not love yourself, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that your worth came from how much you could give, how much you could tolerate, how much pain you could absorb without becoming angry. You became proud of being the person who could handle everything, the person everyone depended on, the person who could sit with someone else's chaos while quietly drowning in their own. And that is the hidden trap.